All black, everything, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back, black.
Welcome to Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're here today joined via Skype by Professor Lynnell L. Thomas, Associate Professor of American Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, the author of the new book, Desire and Disaster, Tourism, Race, and Historical Memory, just published by Duke University Press. How are you doing today, Professor Thomas?
I'm fine, thank you.
One of the things I found interesting in reading through the book is that, you were already working on a New Orleans project before Hurricane Katrina hits in 2005. So talk a little bit about the genesis of this project originally as kind of a New Orleans project around race and tourism, and then how Katrina kind of shaped and shifted some of the framing and focus of the book.
Right. So I think the genesis in some ways may have begun even when I didn't know it, just growing up in New Orleans, being in a tourist city and not a tourist, and confronting some of the images eventually, because in some ways, I wasn't part of the tourist culture. It took a while for me to see what was going on that really conflicted with my own experiences as a Black girl growing up in New Orleans. But once I started to become a little more critical of some of those images, the mammy dolls, the slavery iconography of the city, I think that made me interested in exploring tourism and race in New Orleans.
Well, let me ask you that particularly in terms about growing up, because I think it's often odd, particularly for scholars who do this kind of work, but to grow up in a city like New Orleans, and even though you don't see yourself as part of the tourist culture, there are tourists who see you as part of the tourist culture simply because you're a Black body who's living in the city, and you have no choice in some ways for them to read you that way, other than for them to read you that way.
Right. I mean, in some ways, we are all sort of complicit in New Orleans and other tourist cities of serving as unofficial tour guides or participating in the tourism culture in that way, in celebrating our city as a great destination, of bringing people in and, being excited by the fact that tourists are in town. So we're conditioned to do that early on. So it is this very strange relationship, I think, Black New Orleanians have with the tourism industry, which also provides most of the jobs now in the city of New Orleans.
You talk earlier on in the book about, some of what we just might describe as the media fails, in the beginning when Katrina hits. The fact that they're located in the French Quarter, which gave a certain kind of perception that folks were now safe. These larger narratives around Black New Orleanians and violence. And then, of course, this idea of thinking about New Orleans as a site of, as you describe it, debauchery and degradation. Talk about how some of those factors impacted upon what happens in the aftermath of the actual hurricane hitting the city of New Orleans.
Right. I think the fact that those people most responsible for making decisions, policy decisions, and disseminating the messages about New Orleans did so from a very limited perspective. That really shaped the debates about whether or not to rebuild in New Orleans and who was worth saving and rescuing, both in the early days, just as you said, when rescue efforts were halted because of what were later learned to be exaggerated and false reports of Black rape and violence and looting. So, from my perspective, I had just moved from New Orleans maybe 2 weeks before this happened, and my husband was still in New Orleans. So I was getting information about what was going on like everyone else from the news coverage. So to see initially that reporters who were anchored in the French Quarter, as if that's the only part of the city that mattered, saying that the city was safe, and then to learn that the levees had been breached, but that rescue efforts were halted as I'm awaiting news to see how my family members are doing, and recognizing what that means, that people are dying because of this information, which is later learned to be misinformation. And then even the debates after that impacted public policy decisions, that people were very vocal about talking about this offering an opportunity to rebuild New Orleans. You know, that Hurricane Katrina was a blessing, I think the people even described it as. So it meant the destruction and complete overhaul of public housing, of the New Orleans public school system, the systematic firing of teachers, the dismantling of the union, and now a charter system that I think between 75% and 90% of public schools are charter schools in New Orleans.
You're watching Left of Black. We're joined today by Professor Lynnell Thomas, who's Associate Professor of American Studies at the University of Massachusetts at Boston. She's the author of Desire and Disaster, Tourism, Race, and Historical Memory, looking at the city of New Orleans both before and after Hurricane Katrina. You know, if there's a big argument that you make in the book, it's to point out the kind of contradictions between the post-civil rights realities of New Orleans and the historic idea of New Orleans, right? And so talk a little bit how, you know, New Orleans, and particularly the tourism industry, has tried to balance this investment in a nostalgia for Jim Crow, right? And literally slavery in New Orleans, with this idea that this is a multicultural city, and you come here to consume blackness, right? That's pristine and authentic and all those kinds of things.
Right, and New Orleans, as you mentioned, has this long history of this contradictory marketing of what I call desire and disaster. On the one hand, tourists are being encouraged to celebrate Black culture, a past of voodoo ceremonies or quadroon balls, but even, you know, jazz music, Creole cuisine, at the same time that they're being directed to do it through this racial nostalgia and through adopting this white supremacist memory of slavery, and through a range of ways. One, by the depiction of slavery and focusing almost exclusively on the colonial period and what was supposed to be a more benevolent system of slavery under the French and Spanish. Other ways by allowing tourists to not just visit plantations, but you can even stay overnight in the overseer's cottage, or the repurposing of slave buildings as hotels and restaurants. And even the presence, as you mentioned earlier, of Black people in the city and Black service workers who are accommodating tourists in this way, you know, the service economy that really allows the performance of Black servitude as part of the tourist experience. And in another way, particularly in this post-civil rights moment, that Black themselves are being portrayed as disaster, either bringing on themselves the consequences of Hurricane Katrina, as we heard early on, you know, Black people who didn't evacuate, right, or because of the coded words that we use now to talk about crime or poverty, that in some ways Reconstruction and civil rights has created the disaster of Black enfranchisement and all of these societal ills that people associate with that.
You're watching Left of Black. We're joined today by Professor Lynnell Thomas, author of the new book, Desire and Disaster, Tourism, Race, and Historical Memory in New Orleans. I can remember back in 1996 when Kenny Lattimore dropped his first album CD. He had a great track on it, shot a great video called For You. And the video almost functioned like a commercial for the New Orleans you know, tourism industry. You know, and I was actually living in the city at the time, and the video struck me as like, you know, something that I hadn't even seen yet, you know, in terms of the framing of it. And you give some context for those kinds of moments in terms of the emergence of New Orleans as a Black heritage site. The critical aspect of it being the first Essence Festival being held there in 1995. So talk a little bit about the development of the Greater New Orleans Black Tourism Network, and particularly, the emergence of the Essence Festival as really now what has become an institution in New Orleans, almost 20 years later.
Right. And I think, that's another part of the contradictory processes of New Orleans tourism. I really tried to look at these potential moments of Black resistance and agency within the tourism narrative. And there's certainly been African Americans who have tried to use the civil rights movement to wrest some gains, economic and social and otherwise, from the tourism industry, and have been able, in some cases, to eke out both a living for people working in the service industry or some sort of capital from the tourism industry. But it's a tricky game to be part of that industry. And it is often involved having to succumb or participate in a tourism narrative that denigrates Black culture in some ways. So there have been independent tourism companies that have offered alternative tours and alternative narratives, but they have often faltered. One, in terms of marketing, not being able to get the major hotels and tourism industry to promote them, not having the same level of resources to sustain that type of tour. So that isn't to say that these tours and tourism personnel aren't actively engaged in trying in different ways to subvert the tourism narrative, but it's often been difficult. They've often been at the margins of the mainstream tourism industry or have been sort of incorporated into some problematic narratives.
I've had the chance since Katrina probably to visit New Orleans 3 or 4 times. The first time I did was probably about a good 5 years after Katrina hit. And what struck me about coming to the city was everything that was missing. I mean, the fact that there were whole buildings and apartments that were empty, mall spaces that were empty. The only real life that you saw, was downtown and French Quarter, where all the engines of tourism existed. I mean, there are a lot of folks who suggested that almost symbolically, what happens post-Katrina is almost a form of ethnic cleansing. People get disappeared,
Right.
in that context. Talk a little bit, if you can, about what New Orleans tourism looks like now on the ground, almost a decade, after Katrina.
Right, and you're completely right. New Orleans tourism is thriving right now. It has largely rebounded. I think in 2013 that the tourism industry brought in more money than ever in its history in New Orleans. So while the tourism industry and tourism spaces are thriving and rebuilt, those areas outside of the tourism zones, as you noted, many are still struggling. The progress has been uneven, and it's often been simply from the sheer will and efforts of people who are determined to get back. But almost 100,000 New Orleanians, including most of my family, has been displaced by the storm, have not been able to return for a range of factors. The first hospital since Katrina in New Orleans East was just completed this summer. So 9 years after the storm,
Wow.
people didn't have a hospital that they could go to. I'm not even sure, it wasn't accredited yet in the summer when it opened. So it probably has since been accredited. But, the road home, for instance, and the courts determined that it was racially biased in terms of how it was administered and in terms of how property values were assessed. But from my own experience with the Road Home, which was the Granting Institute program to help people get back and rebuild, it was a road with a lot of potholes, let's just say that. And some places really impassable that made it quite a challenge for people to access funds and get the money to rebuild their homes.
I'm going to take you off to another direction slightly, because Katrina has been kind of, in people's minds recently, as some folks have described, Ferguson as President Obama's Katrina, given the relationship that folks see between the Bush administration and their response to Katrina. You think that's a fair assessment?
Well, I hadn't thought of it that way. Perhaps it seems like Obama is floundering to make sense of that. And perhaps even more so, what we see with Ferguson is more visible the way that people are protesting and responding against what's going on in terms of the government. And in New Orleans, interestingly, and perhaps of course, is the mass incarceration capital, the prison capital of the world. Yeah. And has a long history of police brutality and corruption and an antagonistic relationship between the police department and the community. So, it's interesting because Ferguson and even some of the protests seem symbolic, the way that people are literally lying in the street in a symbolic gesture of the way that Michael Brown's body was left abandoned in the city after he was killed. And people are literally taking over public spaces in a way that tourism hasn't allowed. Tourism is really clearly demarcated the safe tourist space that's protected in New Orleans, the French Quarter, by the police, and the other parts of the city that are marked as dangerous. Too dangerous to rescue, too dangerous to rebuild, and not worth the effort or the investment. So in that way, Ferguson is, there are some important parallels with New Orleans.
We've been joined today by Professor Lynnell Thomas, Associate Professor of American Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. She's the author of the new book, Desire and Disaster, Tourism, Race, and Historical Memory, published by Duke University Press. Thanks for joining us today, Professor Thomas.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.